Welcome to the lecture for segment 1 of the course Demystifying the Brain. In the last lecture we talked about neurons and signaling. We discussed what kind of signaling processes occur in the neurons. We talked about how signals flow down the dendritic tree and get summated in the cell body, and action potential are generated in the axon hillock, and then how they propagate down the axon and arrive at the synapse and communicate, and how these signals are communicated across the synapse to other neurons. Now, in this lecture we will construct networks with these neurons, brain like networks, and see what kind of interesting things these networks can learn. So, in the last lecture we looked at a simple neuron model like this. So, where you have a neuron and it receives inputs via dendrites from other neurons, and in the figure on the left you see one EPSP flowing down on the top dendrite and two EPSPs flowing along on the lower dendrites. All these three get added up in the soma, and then since the negatives dominate, there is no action potential generated, therefore, there is no output. In the figure on the right, there are two EPSPs in the topmost dendrite, then one EPSP in the middle one, and one IPSP in the bottom one. When all of them add up, the positives dominate, and therefore, at the soma the membrane potential crosses the threshold, and you have action potential generation, and there is some output. Now, given that a single neuron behaves like this, if you construct a network of these neurons and think of that network as a brain like network, what kind of computations can such network perform? So, this was a question that was asked by these two people way back in 1940s. So, they were Warren McCullough, who was a neuroscientist, and Walter Pitts, right, who was a mathematician. These two people got together, right, and asked the question, right, what kind of computations can be done with a neuron model that we have just looked at. So, the intuitive neuron model, which we have described verbally until now in the last lecture, the McCullough and Pitts have taken that kind of a neuron model and formulated a mathematical equation, right, to describe such a neuron. This neuron model, which is called the McCullough and Pitts neuron model, is described like this. So, this neuron receives inputs from other neurons. These inputs are like are denoted by x1, x2 and xn. That means there are n inputs that are received by this neuron, and x1, x2 you can think of them as action potentials coming from other neurons. Then the quantities w1, w2 and wn represent the synapses between these other neurons and the neuron that you are looking at in the center. W actually represents the synaptic strength, right, and we have seen in the last lecture the synaptic strength can be high or low and can be positive or negative. So, W can take values which are high or low or positive or negative, and this quantity is called weight in computational domain. So, you have all these weights, and so when all these inputs are received by the neuron, they get added up with the appropriate weight after multiplying them with the appropriate weight, and that is denoted by the summation sigma wi xi. And when the summation crosses a threshold, which is denoted by b in this case, then the output is non-zero, it is 1, and when the summation does not cross the threshold, output is 0. And this thresholding is achieved by the function g, which is basically the threshold function, or what is called a step function, where g of h is given as it is equal to 1 when h is positive or 0, and it is equal to 0 otherwise. So, now if you take these McCullough and Pitts computational neuron models and construct networks out of them, what kind of networks can you construct and how will they behave? So, McCullough and Pitts thought of the brain as a big logic circuit. So, because they have shown that the McCullough and Pitts neuron models can be made to behave like the logic gates. So, as you know that modern computer is constructed out of Boolean logic, so or Boolean circuits, and Boolean circuits are constructed out of three basic fundamental logic gates: the AND gate, OR gate and NOT gate. And by combining these gates in various ways, you can construct any desirable Boolean logic circuit. So, therefore, McCullough and Pitts have shown that the three fundamental logic gates can be constructed using the McCullough and Pitts neuron model. So, for example, if you want the OR gate truth table can be seen at the right top in this slide. So, the inputs are 0 0 0 1 1 0 1 1. So, if the inputs are 0 0, output is 0, and inputs for input 0 1 1 0 and 1 1, output is 1, because if either x1 or x2 is equal to 1, then output is 1. So, you can get this logic gate with a McClelland-Pitts neuron model which has two inputs as shown in the formula here. So, y is equal to g of x 1 plus x 2 minus 0.5. So, if x 1 x 2 are both zeros, right, you have g of minus 0.5 which is 0. So, right, and if even if one of x 1 and x 2 are ones, right, then the argument of g crosses becomes a positive value. So, therefore, y is 1. So, you can see that the McClelland-Pitts neuron model in this case behaves like the logic gate. Similarly, in the AND gate, if you just increase the threshold from 0.5 to 1.5, you can easily verify that the argument becomes positive only when both x 1 and x 2 are equal to 1. That means, x 1 and x 2 are equal to 1, and otherwise the argument is negative. Therefore, y is 0 when for the first three cases, that is 0 0 0 1 1 0 and 1 0, and y is 1 only when both x 1 and x 2 are equal to 1. Then the third gate is NOT gate. So, in this case there is only one input x and there is only one output y. So, when x is 1, y should be 0, and when x is 0, y should be 1, and you get that you can verify that very easily, that this neuron model which has only single input, right, behaves like the logic gate. So, therefore, they showed how you can construct more complicated Boolean networks using McClelland-Pitts neuron models, and they have concluded that brain is a logic engine. So, this kind of a thinking was even fueled by the social and historic background, right, at that time, because they worked in the early part of the 40s, 1940s, and that was the time when the World War was going on, and that was the time when people were exploring the use of computing technology extensively for war applications, for military applications. And as a part of that kind of an effort, large scale effort, right, this huge computer that you can see in this picture, a computer that fills an entire room, right, was built and commissioned in 1946. This computer was called ENIAC, and it was constructed in University of Pennsylvania. It was used for lots of military applications like calculating the trajectories of missiles and cracking enemy codes and things like that. So, with all these things going on in the background, it was only natural that McClelland-Pitts thought of brain as a computer, because they could see all the power of the modern computer, or at least modern by the standards of 1940s, and that itself was quite overwhelming, because at that time people were manually calculating these trajectories of missiles, and that what took 20 hours to do the calculation, with this ENIAC computer was able to solve in only 30 seconds. So, they could really see the power of the computer. So, they thought right, brain also must be like a computer, and right, and neuron is like a logic gate. But point is, it's a very interesting idea, it's very insightful, but unfortunately if you looked at more data from brain, you would very quickly realize that brain is not like a big logic circuit or a Boolean circuit, and the analogy between the computer and brain cannot be taken too far. Why is that? Let us look at several properties, right, and compare brain with a computer. First of all, structurally and in terms of the material that is used, right, brain is a soft organic tissue, it is a 3D volume, right, mass of tissue, and it is wet and it is warm, okay, and whereas the computer, if you look at a motherboard for example, is a rigid, hard, inorganic two-dimensional sheets of matter, and also if you look at the chips which are housed in various chips inside, right, the VLSI circuits themselves, they are two-dimensional sheets of matter. So, in that sense there is a lot of difference. So, now if you look at the signals that are used in a brain and as opposed to a computer, right, we have seen that the neural signals are action potential, they are trains of action potentials. The actual firing patterns vary from neuron to neuron. There are a wide variety of neurons in terms of that can be classified in terms of their firing properties. So, you can see some of these properties, firing patterns in the figure on the left. But if you look at a computer, if you just tap any wire, any bus on any computer and look at the signal, it will look like a simple rectangular wave, going up and down, and going between two voltage limits, so minus 5 volts and plus 5 volts or something like that, right. So, in terms of signals used, both brain and computer are very different. There is even more fundamental difference between brain and computer. Very philosophically, there is a fundamental difference in the design philosophy of these two systems, which is fault tolerance. Now, to illustrate that, let me give a small historical note. So, this incident took place in the late 19th century in the US. So, there was this guy called Phineas Gage, who was a railroad construction worker. His job is to bury bombs and bury explosives, dynamite in soil and soften the soil and break the rock and things like that. So, he was doing that one day, and he was packing the ammunition in a hole, in a deep hole, using a crowbar, and unfortunately the bombs went off, exploded right on his face, and the crowbar went through his head. And actually what you are looking at in this picture is a reconstruction of his skull. So, the crowbar went through his brain, through the frontal lobe of the brain, and remained like that, and most miraculously the person survived that accident. He was taken to a nearby hospital, and the crowbar was removed, surgery was performed, and he survived that surgery. There were some personality changes, but what is quite interesting is the person survived. Now, imagine a similar accident, right, that occurs to a computer. You imagine you driving a metal rod through the chassis of a desktop. I mean, that will be the end of that desktop, right. So, brain is remarkably fault tolerant, whereas a computer is not, does not take very kindly to these kinds of faults. There is another very important difference between brain and computer, which is that brains, or we humans, right, we learn by error feedback, right. You perform an action in under certain conditions, in a certain context, and look at what the environment tells you in that context, and then if it is good, then probably you do the same thing over again next time, and if you get a negative feedback from the environment, you stop doing it next time. Okay, so we learn by trial and error, by getting feedback from the environment, whereas a computer is pre-programmed, and especially some of the older ones like this C3PO from Star Wars, right, these are all like programmed machines. The modern machines with a lot of inputs from AI and machine learning, that is a different story, but otherwise traditionally computers are pre-programmed in a rigid fashion. So, therefore, it was not a very fair comparison to compare brain with a logic circuit and with a computer, and think of the brain as a network of logic gates, just like a Boolean network. So, this realization prompted this person called Frank Rosenblatt in the late 50s to use the same McLuhan-Pitts neuron model, but construct a different kind of a network. He showed how you do not have to hard code the weights the way McLuhan-Pitts have done, because in case of McLuhan-Pitts, what they have done is they have just set the weights of various neurons, so that they behave like an AND gate, an OR gate, and things like that. Whereas in Rosenblatt's, what Rosenblatt has achieved is he showed how you can train a neuron, right, and make it perform some tasks, and he called this network a perceptron because it is able to perceive and classify patterns, visual patterns. So, on the right here on this slide, you see a kind of electronic implementation of the perceptron machine. It is called Mark 1. So, basically perceptron learns by error feedback, just like we do, just like brains do. So, in that box, in this block diagram in the center, you see a box which has a neuron, a McLuhan-Pitts neuron, actually a network of them, and this network receives an input vector x, and it produces an output vector y, and you compare the output vector to some desired vector which is called the target output, and look at the difference between the desired output or the target output and the actual output. If both are the same, then the fine network is doing well. If both are not the same, then there is an error. You feed the error back into the network, and then there are rules by which you can adjust all the weights slightly, so that next time around when you give the same input, the output that you get from the network, which is y, will be slightly closer to the target output. So, you keep doing this iteratively over and over again over lots of input output patterns, right, and after a lot of such such training, right, the network will most likely converge to a correct solution, so that it will learn to map all the inputs x onto all the outputs y. So, how does it work? So, imagine a neuron which takes input vector x, and there are all these weights that are associated with the input connections, and when you calculate the output y using the formula that we have seen a little while ago, you get the output y, and you also have the desired output d. You compare the desired output d with y, and you get the error delta, which is equal to d minus y, and once you know the delta, you can update all the weights w using the formula given in the bottom of the slide. So, delta Wi is equal to eta, which is like a proportionality constant, which is typically a small positive number, times delta the error times the input xi. So, for every input vector x, you present the input vector, get the output, calculate the error at the output, and then use the error which is available at the top and multiply it with the input which is available at the bottom of the connection, right, and then multiply this product with a proportionality constant eta, and that tells you by how much you have to update this weight. So, if you interpret this biologically, what you are doing essentially is, if you take a synapse, on the presynaptic side of the synapse you have some information which is the input, that is xi. On the postsynaptic side you have the information delta, which is the error, and so at the synapse you imagine that the synapse is taking information from its postsynaptic side and fetches the error. It is taking information from the presynaptic side and fetches the input value xi. It is somehow combining these two and figuring out how to change its own strength, the synaptic strength. So, that is biologically, in a very general sense it is feasible, but real synapses do not exactly behave like this. There are some issues, we will be able to come to it later on in the course. Okay, so, what does a network like this do? If you take a single neuron, what exactly is it doing? So, consider the formula again, y is equal to g of sigma wi xi minus b. So, you see that g is the threshold function or the step function. So, therefore, for some values of x, y is equal to 1, and for other values of x, y is equal to 0. And there are points where the output is kind of somewhere in between 1 and 0. Actually, it is a step function, so it cannot take any value between 1 and 0, but so the thing is, when the argument is positive, y is 1, and when the argument is negative, y is 0. So, when the argument, that is sigma wi xi minus b, if it is 0, right, that is when you are on the border between these two regions. So, the regions where output y is equal to 1 and output y is equal to 0 are called the decision regions, because it is as though the neuron is making a decision about the input. So, does the input belong to one class where output is 1, or does it belong to other class where output is 0? That is the decision it is making. Therefore, the two regions are called decision regions, and the boundary between these two regions, which is a straight line in this case, is called the decision boundary. So, we will use these terms later on when we describe more complex problems. So, let us see how a perceptron can learn. So, earlier we showed how you can just hand code the weights of a McCullough and Pitts neuron model to make it behave like an OR gate. So, now we will show how you can train the neuron to on the data of the OR gate to make it learn the OR gate function. So, the OR gate truth table is given here in the table on this slide. So, let us present this data. So, I present 0 0, the first pattern 0 0 to the neuron, and output should be actually 0, but it is actually giving output of 1. So, that is wrongly classified. Okay, and then you present 0 1. So, the data point that you are presenting is shown on the shown in color green in this picture. It is very small, hope you will be able to see it. So, in this case the pattern is correctly classified. So, there is no change. Whenever there is correct classification, there is no change. Then you present 1 1, which is also correctly classified. So, there is no change. Okay, so, out of 4 patterns that the neuron is able to classify 3 patterns correctly. Okay, so, you have 75% accuracy. So, you have to do it over again until you get 100% accuracy. So, present 0 0 again, this time the line, the decision boundary has moved because of learning, the weights have changed a little bit and decision boundary has moved. So, now the response for 0 0 is also correct, and the response for the other pattern 0 1 it is correct, 1 0 is also correct, 1 1 is also correct. Therefore, the neuron has learned to produce correct responses for all the 4 patterns. So, it is now learned the logic gate OR gate. Okay, so, you have 100% accuracy. So, the thing is, what the neuron is doing is it is trying to classify 2 sets of points, right. So, in this simple schematic you have the green points and the blue dots, right, both represent 2 classes, and the neuron is trying to separate these 2 classes, identify that it is one is class 1 and one is class 2, the other is class 2, right, by drawing a line that separates these 2 classes. So, in this example we are looking at 2 dimensional data. So, we are trying to separate the 2 classes using a line, but in general case where the input is higher dimensional, you separate the 2 classes using a hyperplane, right, in higher dimensions. So, in general there can be infinite number of such hyperplanes or lines that can separate the two classes, which is what you can see in this picture. But one problem with perceptron is that they can only classify certain special kinds of patterns called linearly separable patterns. So, what is that? Let us look at this simple schematic. So, on the left you see two classes, you have the green dots and the blue dots. You can separate these two classes using a straight line. But if you look at data on the right side, again you have green dots and blue dots, but no matter how you draw the line, you cannot separate these two classes, right. You will always misclassify some patterns. So, patterns which cannot be separated or classes which cannot be separated by a straight line or hyperplane are called linearly non-separable classes, and it turns out that perceptron cannot learn those kinds of classes, they are too complicated for a perceptron. Okay, so if you take a slightly more complicated logic gate like the XOR gate, whose truth table is given here in the top of the slide, right. So, for input 0 0 you have output is 0 and 0 1 it is 1 and 1 1 is 0 and 1 0 is 1. So, this is depicted in the figure in the bottom, the two opposite diagonal points. So, A and C belong to the same class, and similarly B and D belong to the same class. Now, no matter how you draw the line, right, you will not be able to separate the green dots from the blue dots. Okay, so, that you can verify, right, in this in this video that we have put together. Right. So, on the left side you are seeing how the decision boundary is moving, and on the right side you see the error. So, error should ideally go to 0 if the neuron is able to learn all the right responses correctly, error will go to 0, but in this case even after a lot of training the error does not go to 0, it is stopping at 1. So, it is making a mistake on one data point, and it will not be able to recover from that, it will not be able to learn that perfectly. So, the perceptron is an interesting model, it can learn as opposed to the traditional McCullough and Pitts approach to modeling brain. So, that is what is nice about a perceptron, but its drawback is that it can only learn very simple kinds of classes which can be separate, which are linearly separable. So, therefore, certain authors have launched a strong criticism against perceptrons. So, particularly Minsky and Papert who come mostly from artificial intelligence domain, which is like a rival domain for these kinds of neural network models. They launched a very strong criticism saying that the single perceptron limited in its capabilities. So, therefore, that is true, but then their next statement is not quite correct, because they said it may not be worth studying its multilayer counterparts. So, usually that actually is slightly counterintuitive, because so normally when a network which has two layers shown to be not very powerful, the network with multiple layers or more layers is likely to be more powerful, because it is bigger, it is more complex. The conclusion that Minsky and Papert have drawn is totally contrary to that, a kind of intuitive understanding. So, in their own words, what they have said about perceptron is as follows: the perceptron has shown itself worthy of study despite or even because of its severe limitations. It has many features to attract attention: its linearity, its intriguing learning theorem, its clear paradigmatic simplicity as a kind of parallel computation. There is no reason to suppose that any of these virtues carry over to the many layered version. Nevertheless, we consider it to be an important research problem to elucidate or to reject our intuitive judgment that the extension to multilayer systems is sterile. Basically, they have expressed a prejudice that it is futile to study multilayer versions of a perceptron. Okay, in spite of that kind of warning or a caution from Minsky and Papert, right, people just went ahead and studied multilayer versions of a perceptron, and actually found that the multilayer versions of perceptron are actually a lot more powerful, and they are free from some of the limitations of a perceptron. So, if you look at perceptron, perceptrons have only two layers, there is input layer and the output layer, okay, and there are no layers in between. Whereas, in case of multilayer perceptrons, they can have any number of layers. So, here also you have an input layer, right, and the output layer, and between the two you can have any number of intermediate layers which are called hidden layers. So, in this figure you can see 3 hidden layers, right, and so with these large networks, people have found that you can solve a lot of problems which you could not have solved with a perceptron. And in case of multilayer perceptron, the way you think about them is as input output machines, right. They take an input vector x and produce an output vector y, right, and the as you train the network and as you adjust the weights of the network will learn to map arbitrary inputs onto arbitrary outputs. So, they can learn very complex input output mapping functions. So, therefore, since they are able to map inputs onto outputs, you can think of them as some kind of regression tools. So, in regression, or more familiarly called curve fitting, that you have some data and you fit a curve to the data. So, in this case I have some data which you are able to plot on a plane. So, there is x axis and there is y axis, and you see a bunch of points, bunch of xy points shown in this graph, and you fit them with a curve, and so you want to fit a curve which gives you least error, right, all this data. So, now the training patterns that we use in case of an MLP are like the data point that you see in this graph, and the curve which you are fitting to this data is like the MLP itself. So, the input output function of the MLP is like this curve that you are seeing here. So, basically in curve fitting there is you have only one input variable x which you are mapping onto a output variable y, whereas in case of an MLP you can have any number of input variables because x is a vector, and which is mapped onto any number of output variables which is a vector y. And it turned out that MLP is free from the kind of limitations that we have seen in case of perceptron. MLP is what is called a universal approximator. Well, what does that mean? It has been shown that an MLP with a single hidden layer can approximate any continuous input output function with arbitrary accuracy or a finite input domain given enough number of input neurons in the hidden layer. So, this was shown mathematically, and there is a theorem which proves this. So, to illustrate that, I mean this is a very interesting and a powerful theorem in neural network literature, but we know these kinds of results in our simple regression literature. So, for example, look at this example. So, we have all this data which we were trying to fit with a curve just a moment ago. So, let us assume we try to fit a straight line to this data, and which you can see this green line is a straight line which we are trying to fit to the data, and it is a very bad fit, right. So, that means if you fit the formula y is equal to a naught plus a 1 x, right, it is a linear fit. That means you are fitting it with a polynomial of degree 1, right, you get that green line which is a very bad fit. But on the other hand, if you fit a cubic function to this data, that is y is equal to a naught plus a 1 x plus a 2 x square plus a 3 x cube, you get this blue curve, right, which is a much better fit, and here the polynomial is of degree 3. So, basically what you are saying in this simple example is, as you increase the degree of the polynomial with which you are fitting the data, that your fit gets better and better. So, what we were seeing in case of neural network is something very similar. So, as you increase the number of hidden nodes, right, and the fit gets better and better. So, that is what the essence of this theorem is. What this theorem says is, a network with a single hidden layer is good enough to learn a wide range of real world functions, right, and if you have enough number of hidden neurons in the hidden layer, then you will be able to learn any function with arbitrary accuracy. So, let us take a problem which was not solved by a perceptron, and we will show using some simple calculations that an MLP can solve this problem. So, let us take the XOR problem. So, we will take an MLP which has a single hidden layer, and that hidden layer has 2 neurons. So, the input to the network is 2 variables x1 and x2, and there are 2 hidden neurons, and their outputs are V1 and V2, and finally the outputs, the V1 and V2 neurons project to a single output neuron, and whose output is y. So, therefore, the input output relationships of all these neurons are given by this formulae. So, V1 is given as g of x1 plus x2 minus 0.5. So, that is like an OR gate, and V2 is given as g of x1 plus x2 minus 1.5. So, that is like an AND gate which we have seen before, and y is equal to g of V1 minus V2 minus 0.5. So, what is happening here is, so V1 is given by g of x1 plus x2 minus 0.5. So, therefore, if you see in this figure, so this whole region is where V1 is equal to 1, and this whole region V1 is equal to 0, and in this case this whole region V1 is 1, here V2 is 0, and here V2 is 1. So, if you take V1 minus V2, you get a kind of a band where the y is 1 this in the center inside this band and y is 0 outside on either side of the band. Okay, so therefore, y is equal to g of v 1 minus v 2 minus 0.5, right, approximates the XOR gate, it learns the XOR gate. But what we have done just now is a kind of a simple hand calculation, right, just we wanted to show that a network which has a hidden layer can do something that a perceptron cannot do, but you cannot do the same thing with large scale real world problems. So therefore, we will have to come up with a learning algorithm, a learning scheme by which you can train the weights automatically, so that the network will learn the relationship between input and output automatically without us calculating the weights by hand. So, we will switch back to the same learning scheme, right, where you have the network inside this box, the NN, and then input is presented to the network, and you get the output, and you compare the output with the target output or desired output, look at the error, and error is fed back to the network, and using the error you update all the weights slightly, so that next time around when you give the same input x, you get the output y which is closer to the target output t. Now, this is actually a very interesting departure from the traditional way of solving problems, because traditionally if you want to solve a problem, right, which consists of transforming certain input quantities x into some output quantities y, right, you have to figure out what is the relationship between x and y and come up with a set of rules, set of calculation steps, and execute those steps to transform x into y. But with this kind of neural network approach, right, it just learns from experience. All that you do is expose the network to lots of inputs and outputs. These are examples, these are instances from experience. The network will automatically learn to do this map by training. So, this is also very similar to how we learn, right, by how you teach say somebody by trial and error. So, just visualize how you would teach a small child how to read. So, perhaps you will show the child a picture of a letter A and ask the child to pronounce it as A. If the child says A, you give some you pat on the back or give some lollipop or something like that. If the child says B, then that is a wrong response. So, then you give a warning or a little slap or something like that, and you by this kind of error feedback, right, the child gradually learns to read the letters correctly. So, that is exactly how an MLP is trained to learn the map. So, the question of training the network, training the MLP, right, developing an algorithm for training MLP initially ran into some difficulties, because in case of perceptron it was very easy how to derive the learning rule, because in case of perceptron you had an error at the output and you had input xi, and by multiplying these two you were able to update the weights. But whereas in case of an MLP there is a problem, because you had many layers and error is available at the output layer, and you had to change the weights everywhere at all these stages. Okay. So, now you need error throughout the entire network to update the weights. How could you use error which is available here to update the weights which are very far from the place where errors are available? Okay, so, this was the challenge, and initially it was not clear how to overcome this challenge. So, this problem is called credit assignment problem, or right, and but very soon it was solved by several people. There is a long history of how people have discovered this algorithm over and over. Many people have discovered this algorithm again and again without the knowledge that others have already discovered it. Thing is, after the severe criticism of Minsky and Papert in the 60s about perceptrons, for a long time nobody bothered about these kinds of network models, nobody bothered to study multilayer versions of perceptrons. So, there was a lull in research for nearly 2 decades from 60s, and only in the 80s the research has picked up again. But in the 70s there was this solitary hero called Paul Verbos, who did his thesis at MIT on the learning algorithm for multilayer perceptrons, but nobody paid attention to his work because this area was not popular. It was like a taboo to work on multilayer perceptrons. So, later on in the 80s several groups have discovered the same algorithm nearly simultaneously. So, one was Rumelhart, McClellan and Williams in 86, then Parker in 85 and LeCun in 85. They all discovered the same algorithm independently. So, in the multilayer perceptron which is trained by this algorithm, there are 2 stages. In the first stage So, the input x is presented to the network to the input layer, and then it is made to climb upwards, right, and from input to the hidden layer and hidden layer to the output layer and so on, and at the output layer you get the output y. Then you compare the output y with the desired quantity, desired output t, right, and you get the error which is delta, that is t minus y. Once you have the delta, you back propagate this delta, right, from output layer to hidden layer, and if you have more hidden layers, you back propagate the error further down all the way to the first hidden layer. And once you have all the deltas for over all the hidden layers of the network, then you can update all the weights in one shot using like this. So, for any given connection, you take the delta of the neuron at its postsynaptic side, and you take the output of the neuron on its presynaptic side, and multiply these two and multiply the product with a step size eta, right. You have the update value for the corresponding weight. So, this algorithm is called a back propagation algorithm, because in this algorithm you have two passes. The input first goes all the way to the output in the forward pass, and in the reverse pass or the back propagation pass, right, the errors are back propagated from output all the way to the first hidden layer, and then you update all the weights in one shot. So, let us see how you can train an MLP on an XOR problem. So, what we have done before is we hand calculated all the weights and showed how an MLP can learn XOR problem. So, in this case we take a huge MLP. This has two hidden layers. So, there is one hidden layer here which has 15 neurons, another hidden layer here which has again 15 neurons, and then there is the input and you can see the inputs on the left, and that is the single output y, and you have the XOR data is given like this. So, these two, the yellows belong to one class and the blues belong to the second class. Okay, so, if you train this network, let us see what happens. So, the reds and yellows that you see in the moving animation on the right side are the decision regions, right. So, the yellow regions should fill the yellow dots and the blue region should fill the blue dots, and that has already happened very quickly, it learns very quickly, right. So, the network is able to learn this task. Now, let us look at a more complicated problem. So, in case of XOR, it is more complicated than it is linearly non separable, but it is still not very complicated. So, take this example where there are two classes, right, and this is called the double spiral problem. The two classes consist of two sets of data, right. One is this yellow line, the yellow spiral, the other is the blue spiral. Okay, so, it is very hard to, you cannot just draw a line and separate these two data sets, right. So, it is a very hard problem, and let us see how an MLP can solve this. So, in this case the MLP has only one hidden layer and it has just 15 nodes or 15 neurons. So, let us see how this learns it. So, again you see the two decision regions. The yellow region is supposed to fill ultimately only the yellow points, and the blue region should fill only the blue points, but it did not happen, it's so let us erase this. Okay, so, in this case now we are looking at a much bigger network which has 3 hidden layers, each having 15 neurons, and this is kind of getting there very quickly. So, the yellow regions only fill the yellow part. Okay, next we are looking at 5 hidden layers, right, each having 15 neurons. Okay, this is learning very quickly. So, you can see the yellow decision regions filling the yellow dots, we are almost there already, right. Yeah, it is there, it is learnt, it is learnt the yellow region is filled the yellow dots completely, and the blue regions have filled the blue dots completely. Okay, so, you can see that an MLP with multiple layers can learn pretty complicated functions. So, that is what is nice about an MLP, it is a general solution to large class of problems. So, if you want to model for example something that happens, it is happening in the visual system, right, you are looking at an image and you want to explain how it processes an image. So, whether in the brain, whether you are looking at visual processing or auditory processing or processing touch or somatosensory processing, it is all done by the same set of neurons, right, or similar neurons. Whereas similarly in case of MLP, right, no matter what your problem domain is, the same kind of a network with same kind of neurons and generalized architecture, generalized learning rule can be applied to solve the problem. So, that is one thing, something that is very appealing about an MLP. And also we have this theorem which guarantees that given enough number of hidden neurons, the MLP can approximate arbitrarily complex target functions, right. Now, also your back propagation algorithm also applies for arbitrary number of layers, and even if you have partial connectivity. The examples that we have seen involve full connectivity, that means from every layer to the next layer all the neurons are connected, every possible connection exists. Whereas even if you leave out some connections, right, the same algorithm applies. The only condition for the algorithm to work is that there should not be any loops in the network. So, and then the network can be trained in parallel, and it has been also what is interesting for us, right, in this course is that the network has been applied to a wide variety of phenomena in psychology and neuroscience. But there are certain drawbacks of this network model, especially from neuroscience point of view, which is that the neuron model is too simple. I mean we have seen what kind of assumptions we have made, right, and how far we have moved, right, from the realistic neuron with all the spiking activity and the kind of McClellan-Pitts neuron where the output is simply 1 or 0. So, another artificial feature about the MLP is that it requires a teaching signal, what is called a teaching signal, that is the target vector, right. So, we have seen that if you want to train the network, you need a whole target vector T, whereas that is biologically unrealistic. You do not have that kind of signal available in the brain to tell various neurons how they should learn. Then another aspect of backprop which is artificial is that it is biologically unreasonable, unfeasible, because so the algorithm involves back propagation of errors, right, downwards towards the input layer. Now, so we know that synapse is a unidirectional signaling structure. So, signal can only go from presynaptic side to the postsynaptic side, because the neurotransmitter is present only on the presynaptic side and it then goes to the postsynaptic side. Whereas in backpropagation algorithm, you want the signal to be able to go from output to the input, and that is not possible. Okay, so there people have tried to justify the backpropagation algorithm by invoking certain features from neurobiology, like backpropagating action potentials, things like that, but we let us not get into those details at this point. But what is interesting is even these very simplified generalized networks can explain several phenomena from psychology and neuroscience. So, what we will do in the next segment of this lecture is we will take several phenomena from psychology and neuroscience and show how the networks can be applied to these problems.